Hello, folks. This is Dave Lentz with ReasonandBalance.com, here to present some pictures and a video on this project, more or less more from a mere picture-taking exercise on my part into this video. It sort of grew and grew and grew. And in a second, we're going to show some pictures and videos of the monuments. Hopefully, you'll appreciate the aesthetic values of those monuments. But naturally, they are a source of considerable controversy, given events in Charlottesville and in Baltimore and in St. Louis and a few other places. Let me tell you a little bit about myself, extremely briefly, to give you some flavor. I actually lived on Monument Avenue for about 8 years. Let me see. No, 5. I'm sorry, 5 years. In fact, I lived my bedroom window. And some of these pictures you're going to see, you're going to be able to actually see my old bedroom window. Actually overlooked the statue of General Lee. I actually also lived for another 4 years in an area called Churchill in the city of Richmond. So I have some experience in the area. I was originally raised up through the age of 12 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I was born in Fort Knox, Kentucky, and at the age of 12, we moved to Richmond, and I went to college in Central Virginia, and went to the University of Richmond to go to law school. Went to Randolph-Macon College in Ashland. Let me I just say that to sort of say that I have both sort of a little bit of a northern and a southern perspective of the whole situation. And the purpose of this video is not, I'm really not here to argue one way or the other. I'm here more or less to help people understand the situation and let them make up their own minds. So I'm going to try to be fair and balanced. And I hope I do a good job of that, and that naturally means that I'm probably going to say something that's probably going to upset everybody. But I hope that in the course of doing so, I also raise strong points that those people would like to make themselves. But I'm going to keep it brief and kind of light. I'm not here to stir the pot, so to speak. I'm here to basically help people know what's going on. So, anyway, let me just say to start that slavery is an awful thing. I believe that most right-minded people in this country and elsewhere believe the same thing. That so nothing that is said in this video is to be taken be an endorsement of slavery, because it's certainly not. Okay, here comes. This is a statue to one of those legends of the Confederacy, Stonewall Jackson, Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson. He went to West Point. He served in the U.S. Army during the Mexican War. Where have you heard that before? He taught at VMI, Virginia Military Institute. He was a brigade commander at 1st Manassas, otherwise known, Manassas is also known as Bull Run, where there was 2 battles there, and at the very first one, he got his nickname Stonewall after arriving with reinforcements to help turn the tide of battle. I don't know, I think I'm paraphrasing, but the saying, there was Bernard B., I think, was a general, and the Confederates were a little bit stressed or pressed during the battle, and another Confederate general said, look, there stands Jackson like a stone wall, rally behind the Virginians. And that's how Jackson got his name. That may not be an exact quote, but it's pretty close to what was said. Oh, here it is. There is Jackson standing like a stone wall. Let us determine to die here, and we will conquer. Rally behind the Virginians. There you go. All right. So, Jackson is thought of as some kind of military genius, and he was known for his successful Shenandoah Valley campaign early in the war, very early in the war, where he defeated 3 separate Union armies up and down the Shenandoah Valley. After the Peninsula Campaign, when he came down to Richmond to help Lee during the Peninsula Campaign, Lee reorganized the Army and gave Jackson command of the Second Corps. When Lee took command in 1862, he reorganized the Confederate Army at that time into 2 corps, later 3. The First Corps he gave to James Longstreet. What an interesting story he has. He doesn't have a statue on Monument Avenue. It's basic, a lot of Southerners never forgave Longstreet basically because he dared to criticize Lee from time to time. But the history for Longstreet is probably that he had probably a better relationship with Lee than a lot of his detractors think he did. But in any event, that's a whole other story. But anyway, Longstreet was in charge of the First Corps. Jackson was in charge of the Second Corps, and many consider Stonewall Jackson to be Lee's right-hand man before Jackson was killed in 1863. And he looked upon him, and many look upon Jackson as sort of a military genius. He believed in keeping the enemy off guard. He believed that once the enemy was in retreat, you followed until you crushed him and destroyed him. Never let the enemy have enough time to prepare fully to fight you was sort of what he believed in. And his troops were known as the foot cavalry because they could travel long distances, even though since they were infantry, they weren't cavalry. His foot cavalry was not cavalry at all. It was infantry troops that were famous for being able to do quick, long marches, and this constantly kept the Union Army off balance. So Jackson is viewed as some sort of military genius, and he's still studied today, from what I understand. He was involved in the capture of Harper's Ferry by Confederate troops, and he played a crucial role, if not decisive role, in winning the Battle of Chancellorsville. And it was there, when he was out scouting enemy positions, that he was accidentally shot by his own troops, and later died. They had to amputate his arm before he died. And actually, I think I saw a picture of his arm, believe it or not. Somebody actually took a picture. Anyway, I won't go there. But anyway, he, I think what's the name of the place? Guinea Station. It's out there. It's near Thornburg. It's about 3 or 4 miles away from Thornburg is where he died. The house is still there. You can go in there and visit. And back then, remember, they didn't have anesthesia and all that stuff. So that was just a horrific operation to go through, an amputation back in those days. Interestingly enough, Jackson was a very religious man who I didn't have enough time to confirm this, but I think he would refuse to fight on Sundays. I think that's the case. I'm not sure. Anyway, he also, I believe, died on a Sunday, which he said he always wanted to do, which was die on Sunday. Like I said, he was a very religious man. He has some, for those who want to study him further, he's got some interesting quotes. And his last words were, "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees." It's kind of poetic. But in any event, Stonewall Jackson, a true legend. Okay, this is Jeb Stuart, and Jeb Stuart is a sort of a dashing character. Well, I should say character. He was the Cavalry Corps commander for the Confederate Army, but he does cut a dashing figure, and as you can see that in the statue here. He was born in 1822, and he attended Emory and Henry College before attending West Point. Like Lee, he served, and Jefferson Davis for that matter, he served in the U.S. military before the Civil War. As a matter of fact, he first met Robert E. Lee when Lee was the superintendent at West Point and Stuart was a student. Jeb Stuart fought in the Indian Wars in Bleeding, Kansas, which of course was a slavery conflict in the Kansas, Missouri area immediately prior to the war, and he also participated and was an important actor in the capture of John Brown at Harper's Ferry. He resigned from the U.S. military like Lee did when the conflict between the states became apparent, and he joined the Confederate Army. Originally, he was serving under Stonewall Jackson, which would have been up in the valley, the Shenandoah Valley campaign, and later he became Lee's famous eyes and ears as he eventually was placed by Lee in charge of the Confederate Cavalry Corps. He was known as a dashing and daring cavalry commander, of course, and twice led very famous reconnaissance expeditions where his cavalry rode totally around the Union Army, once during the Peninsula Campaign and another time at Antietam. However, on another occasion, one of his missions, he got sidetracked up in Pennsylvania, and although he did capture some considerable supplies, his being out and away from Lee during the lead up to the Battle of Gettysburg has been criticized, and many argue that it may have cost Lee some valuable reconnaissance prior to the start of the Battle of Gettysburg. That's a controversial point. But like I said, it wasn't like he was totally wasting his time when he did that. He did capture some things. He got as far north as Harrisburg, PA during that ride. And in any event, that's a source of debate. All right. During Grant's overland campaign after, I guess this would have been after the Wilderness and Spotsylvania Courthouse, immediately thereafter in early May of 1864, Sheridan was going to sort of go on a raid attacking the northern extremities of the city of Richmond. Stuart came south to head him off, and there was a battle at a place called Yellow Tavern, and unfortunately for Stuart, he was wounded in that battle. Incidentally, I believe that George Custer participated in that battle, and that battle is right where the intersection of I-295 and Interstate 95 are, about 7 or 8 miles north of downtown Richmond. Stuart was seriously wounded but died the next day from his wounds in Richmond. That was on May the 12th, 1864. In any event, okay, let's get down to it. Like I said, slavery is awful. There are situations where parents were separated from their children. If they were taken into slavery, families were torn apart. When slaves were captured, when they were brought over on boats, a lot of times a lot of them didn't make the trip because they died in transit because quarters were awful. They were packed in these small places in the bottoms of these ships. It was horrific. They were put in irons, painful chains, and things like that. And if they tried to escape, they might get whipped, or some of them would even get lynched. They would work extremely hard, long hours. But even beyond all that, even if you had a master that didn't work your fingers to the bone 7 days a week, 365 days a year, the very fact that you're considered a slave and a second-class person, or slaves were actually considered to be property. They weren't, they didn't have the rights of people. The humiliation and disrespect shown by the very institution is reprehensible. What can you say? I mean, so like I said, that's what we're assuming here on this video. You can assume, for the sake of argument, I didn't have the resources or the time, because it would have taken a whole separate video, maybe a book, who knows, to go into the relationships that each of these men would have had with their own individual slaves. Not to say that that subject's irrelevant, but I just can't deal with it here. I don't have, like I said, I don't have the time or resources to cram it into this video. But I'm not sure about Maury, but they all the let me see, Lee, Jackson, and Stewart all had slaves, and Davis, and I'll leave it to you for your study on that issue. Okay, so let me just say this. I am going to try to, one of the reasons why I want to show the video is try to give folks out there some idea of why folks who love those statues, and when I say love those statues, I mean love those statues, feel the way they do about them. And I think when I go through some of the history of it, you may gain a better appreciation of it. But before I turn to that subject and that portion of the video, let me make some points. Number one, it seems to me obviously a very strong argument that the opponents of those statues would be that these gentlemen supported slavery. It severely adversely affected our ancestors, our family, and that is unquestionably an exceedingly strong argument, and that every day when I go to work, I got to drive past those statues, or I see them every day, and I find them to be offensive. Well, I mean, I think that a fair-minded person would have to acknowledge that that is a possibility, and indeed a likelihood that a significant portion of the African American population in the city of Richmond, or anybody else visiting the city going past those statues, could or would, in fact, be offended by their presence. So on a certain level, people who like those statues and want to keep them sort of have to overcome that argument. And but we'll see. Who knows? That's for everybody else to determine. Like I say, I'm just trying to lay it out. And so the golden rule, which most religions and most people basically agree with and abide by, is treat others like you would like to be treated. The golden rule. So the golden rule would seem to indicate that based on that argument, the statues, that they should be removed. Well, let's all I can say is what one needs to do is look at all the facts to try to figure out where the scales are on this situation. Let me make this observation, and this is a crucial point for those who are admirers of those statues and who want to keep them. The proponents of the statues. The proponents of the statues might say might argue something along these lines. Let's take the pyramids, for example. They were built by slaves. You don't hear a big public outcry in Egypt or elsewhere in the international community to remove the pyramids. Now that may seem far afield, but it's that situation. When you think about it, let's take a couple things. Number one, the pyramids, well, were probably built by a lot of different types of slaves, but one particular group would have been the Israelites. And so, and they aren't black. So the point here being that the institution of slavery affects all races, all colors, all creeds. And this whole example goes to point out that slavery has been around since ancient times. In fact, probably even before recorded history. If one army would conquer another territory, they normally would take captives who would end up being slaves. It occurred during the Roman Empire. So slaves was sort of the status quo, the natural order of things since the beginning of time. And the reason that this is an important point is because it raises the very fundamental important question: is it fair to judge historical figures based on contemporary notions of morality and decency? To me, that's a slippery slope to expect to assess somebody in ancient history, because in essence, from the southern perspective, the southern landed and aristocratic and southern white perspective, slavery had been around forever, and who are these northerners to tell us what to do? Our economy here in the South, which is very agriculturally oriented, depends in large measure on slavery. And if you take slavery away from us, our economy may collapse, and we may suffer financial ruin. Lots of people, who knows, there may be a lot of poverty as a result. And so, twofold things. The South would argue, of course, that they're going to suffer financial ruin. And two, this has been going on forever, and we're not doing anything that's unusual. As a matter of fact, what we're doing is the normal thing, and what you're suggesting is the abnormal thing. What you're requiring of us and invading our territory to do is the abnormal thing, and which is the outrageous thing. Now, slavery had begun to lose favor in, I think, the British Empire prior to the American Civil War, and the world was more or less becoming more civilized, and people were waking up to the notion that it was not a good thing. But still, as of 1861, the guys and Lee and Stewart and Jackson and Davis could make the argument that they're not doing anything that wasn't believed widely and done widely around the world for a long time. So and on that basis, you have to say, well, maybe these guys really aren't that bad. They may have been misguided, but they aren't that bad. And the other point, before I forget to say it, is these gentlemen symbolized other qualities that we greatly admire, and we'll touch upon those when we talk about the videos of the statues and all that kind of stuff. And so there are things about these guys that are worthy of admiration by people of all races, colors, and creeds, and that's really what we're celebrating. So there is that point. Let me just make this strong point too. When slaves were captured and brought over here, a lot of times the people that captured them were in fact black folk themselves, and they would take them, and I think the Arabs were also sort of involved. But I'm just raising that point to basically say that the idea of slavery is not necessarily a slight just towards blacks. I'm just reiterating the point that it's towards all folks of all races. We had black slave traders themselves who basically enslaved other blacks and shipped them off to Brazil or to America or wherever. So I sort of want to reiterate and make that point. And we will point out in the video that Richmond, it was the center of focus for the Union Army to capture during the war. Let me just say this also. Now, of course, Richmond is, to its credit, has been unique in the sense that these statues have been around without really much racial protest or tension. Not that I ever felt when I lived in the city of Richmond. And blacks, African Americans have been, or rather constituted a majority of the population in the city of Richmond for about 30 or 40 years. I think at least since the early 70s. And not only that, they controlled city council. We've had several black mayors, and when we had the city manager system, we had black city managers and white ones. So the point that I'm making is that what I sort of get a little bit upset about, frankly, is that a lot of this stuff seems to have been caused by, not by any kind of movement that arose within the city of Richmond. It seems to have been caused by events in St. Louis, Baltimore, and then in Charlottesville that have brought this to the forefront. So it seems like a bunch of outsiders who want to be a little bit aggressive in expressing their opinions have caused this big rigmarole now in the city of Richmond. Because these statues, in terms of sheer political power, these statues could have been removed a long time ago. And one might make the point that, well, the blacks, the African Americans were afraid to speak up about it. When I was living in the city of Richmond, I can honestly say that I never felt that at all. That there was any failure on the part of anybody to speak up, or that the African American community would be afraid to say something. Now, do I know that that's not the case? That somehow they were just biting their tongue and they were afraid to say something? Is that a possibility? Yes, it's a possibility, but all I can say is my experience was I didn't get that sense at all, because, like I said, to the city's credit, the one thing, and I take great pride in actually in terms of the city, is I've always thought that race relations in the city of Richmond were very good. Maybe I'm wrong, I don't know. So I never felt that there was any hidden resentment to those statues. There is grounds for that being the case, but I never felt that. And in a matter of fact, as we will see, there's the Arthur Ashe statue, which more or less shows that, there's Arthur Ashe right next to these Confederate generals, and it just goes to show that somehow the people in the city of Richmond, again, to their credit, have found a way to resolve these differences, if to the extent that they exist at all. And there's Arthur Ashe, so great, on Monument Avenue. So like I said, this seems a little bit like outsiders coming in. And then we have, the national press, and you'll hear a commentary about, so they look askance at these generals, but they don't take into account that those statues are near and dear to the community here. A substantial number of members of the community here have deep feelings for that. But also, number two, tourists. I mean, people are interested in the Civil War, and they visit the city of Richmond in part because of those statues in the Civil War. So they have historical significance and represent, in a sense, the story of the nation, an important and a critical, vital chapter in the history of the nation, and certainly of this city, of the city of Richmond. So Richmond is very, very unique, more unique, frankly, than Atlanta, even though, I know it was burned down, that's terrible, and other southern cities which also suffered horrifically during the war. But Richmond was the focus of operations for the Union Army, and it was the capital of the Confederacy. No other place can really sort of say that. So like I said, it seems a little bit like outsiders are telling us what to do. We've had a majority black community for a long time. This could have happened a long time ago, so I don't get the real sense that there's been this muzzle placed on the black community about those statues. I could be wrong, but I never sensed that when I lived in the city or lived down there. The statues have artistic value. So in any event, let me just say this, and like I said, there are other values. All of these men had successful careers and sacrificed a lot to protect their homes and their way of life. That is sort of what is being celebrated in these statues. Now, my own situation, I will just say briefly this. When I grew up, because I was born in Fort Knox, my relatives sort of always thought of me as being the rebel of the group. And so when I was a little boy playing cowboys and Indians, we didn't have video games. We had these guns, and we'd go around in bushes, and we fired our friends and all this kind of stuff. We even had a little Civil War cannon. And I was always ended up being on the southern side because my friends thought of me as the rebel. And I sort of, in a sense, embraced the rebel cause. Simply because, number one, I was always called one, and number two, I thought these guys, Lee and Jackson, were kind of neat guys. And to me, I thought of them more as cowboys, sort of in the cowboys and Indians, American Indians sense, than I did, the Western type thing with the guns and riding horses and all that kind of stuff, than I did as being pro-slavery. I mean, when I thought of these guys, I never thought once about the issue of slavery, that they represented slavery. And so I sort of suspect that for a lot of people and a lot of proponents of those statues, when they like Lee and when they like Jackson, they don't think of that they're supporting slavery and don't necessarily think of them in the context of being pro-slave. But like I said, and I think that the whole issue was, for these men was much more complicated than being just pro-slavery. And I think that what the proponents of those statutes celebrate by admiring those statues is the courage that these men show in defending their homelands, the personal sacrifices that they made on behalf of the cause that they believed in. And they're not admired because they supported a cause that supported the institution of slavery. Okay, and here, this is kind of a spectacular and sort of a complicated monument. It's quite impressive. It's replete with a lot of what Jefferson Davis had to say, some quotes from some of his speeches. But Jefferson Davis is a very interesting character. He was a former plantation owner, but he had a sort of a sterling resume prior to the outbreak of hostilities. He was a graduate of West Point, interestingly enough. He served in the U.S. Army and fought during the Mexican-American War, where he led a successful charge in the Battle of Monterrey, and he was later wounded in the Mexican-American War. He was from Mississippi. He was a Democrat who served in the U.S. Senate before the Civil War, and after that he again served in the U.S. government when he became the Secretary of War in the Franklin Pierce administration, and then he returned to the U.S. Senate. He always believed strongly in states' rights and their inherent power to leave the Union, secede or withdraw, secede or withdraw from the United States if a state wanted to do so. After the Civil War, he was imprisoned for a while and indicted for treason. However, he was pardoned by Andrew Johnson, I believe, in 1868. He also ultimately did serve after the war as president of an insurance company and wrote some books, and he died in 1889. Like I said, he was a plantation owner, and so as such, he did own some slaves. Like I said, the issue of relationships that these Confederate officers have with particular slaves or with their slaves is a complicated subject which is sort of beyond the scope of this particular video.
Sure I can get it.
Okay, folks, before we show you the other statues on Monument Avenue, we're going to break things up a bit and present two relatively short, hopefully informative presentations on McClellan's Peninsula Campaign in 1862 and Grant's Overland Campaign in 1864, both of which affected Richmond and its citizens greatly. Okay, folks, this is David Lentz with reasonandbalance.com. Necessity is the mother of invention. I intended to do a nice map for you all with some good graphics, but I can't get it to work out right, so I'm going to do the old-fashioned way, the old chalk talk. We're talking about the monuments on Monument Avenue, and I just wanted to sort of give you some background on just a thumbnail sketch of a little bit of Civil War history to try to give you some understanding of why folks in Richmond feel about those statues the way they feel about those statues. Like I said, I'm trying to be even and balanced on how we deal with this subject, but this is sort of more or less looking at it from why the people that love those statues love those statues. Okay, we're going back to the 1862, the second year of the Civil War, and at that time the head of the Union forces was a guy by the name of McClellan, and he instituted what was known as the Peninsula Campaign. He came up, basically landed I believe this is the York River right here, and this is the James River down here, somewhere in here. Anyway, I'm not going to, this is not a history lesson. This is basically to give you a general idea. But he landed somewhere down here, and this is a peninsula here, because there's a couple rivers that come up here, and they come up here. There's like, here's West Point, Williamsburg is like in here, and he had an army of over 100,000 Union troops. So he had a significant army. This is in the second year of the Civil War, and he's marching this way, and he wants to take Richmond. Now, of course, Richmond is the capital of the Confederacy. That's where Jeff Davis had his Confederate administration. And at the time that McClellan started his campaign, the head of the Confederate forces was Joe Johnston. A lot of people think that Lee was the main general in the Confederate Army from the get-go in the Civil War, but actually in the late spring, early summer of 1862, Joe Johnston was basically the lead Confederate general in the Eastern Theater of Operations, which is everything basically along the southeast coast. And he was the lead Confederate general, and Lee, who had just rejected a request by the Union Army to be the head of the Union forces, feeling like he could not turn against his native Virginia, became Jeff Davis as really his primary military advisor, but he was not in charge of any troops, I don't believe, at this time. Anyway, that would change during the course of what is known as the Peninsula Campaign. Because you're coming up this peninsula here, the Peninsula Campaign of George McClellan, who would later run for president against Abraham Lincoln in 1864, I believe. But anyway, so McClellan's got about 105,000, I think 100,000 plus troops. Now, like I said, this isn't a history lesson, so please feel free to check us out on our historical facts, but like I said, we're going to give you the old college try in terms of setting this situation out. So we're going to talk first about the Peninsula Campaign of George McClellan, and then we're going to talk about Grant's Overland Campaign very briefly as well, which was in 1864. But this campaign is in 1862, okay? Second year of the Civil War. All right, so McClellan's coming up this way. He's moving towards Richmond this way. There was a battle in Williamsburg, and the Confederates generally decided that they were going to retreat towards it because they could take up better defensive positions east of Richmond. But McClellan's got a very large force. Offhand, I don't remember how big Johnston's forces were. They weren't quite as big as McClellan's, but he had a substantial force himself. In any event, this area here can be kind of marshy at times and flat, but in any event, the Confederates thought that they could better defend Richmond back here as opposed to trying to do it down here. Let me just say this. Eventually, the Union Army basically got control down here in Tidewater, and for that reason, you know, Richmond wasn't able, at this point in the war, to get supplies for the city up through the James River because the Union basically by this point in the campaign pretty much controlled the bottom portion of the James River. So in any event, McClellan's coming towards Richmond. Okay, so this kicked off in the late spring, early summer of 1862, what was known as the Peninsula Campaign. It basically started at Drury's Bluff. Oddly enough, the first action in the war was a small naval action. The Union forces brought some boats up the James River. This is the James River, and actually got to someplace right in here, which I think is about 7 miles south of the city, called it's called Drury's Bluff, and there was a naval action there. The losses were less than 50 people on both sides. When I say losses, in this video, when I say losses, that's a combination of killed, wounded, and or captured. But in any event, the Union tried to basically steam right up to Richmond. I don't know what they intended to accomplish with the small force that they had there, but that's what they tried to do. The Confederates were able to stop them right here, and that attack on Richmond fell short. There were only a small number of vessels in that action. I think the Monitor may have actually been one of the ships involved in that. I'm not really sure. The one that fought the Merrimac / Virginia, if you know the Battle of the Ironclads. Anyway, that occurred right here. Okay, that occurred. That occurred in what, the 15th of May of 1862. And then we get more into McClellan's overland campaign. He, let's see, what was next? Hanover Courthouse. This is Hanover Courthouse. It's probably about 18 miles from downtown Richmond. This is US 301 goes through it. Up here, I don't have that depicted here. I'm trying to make the map too complicated. So the Battle of Hanover Courthouse sort of kicked off the overland campaign. There were I'm going to give combined loss figures on both sides, both Union and Confederate. There were about 1,300 losses combined at the Battle of, it's a minor battle, but it's about 13 of Hanover Courthouse. And then that was followed by Seven Pines. Now this is a very, very important battle in the history of the Civil War, because it was at this battle that Johnston got wounded, and it was shortly thereafter that President Jeff Davis of the Confederacy appointed Robert E. Lee to take Johnston's place, because Johnston had been wounded, and Lee took over the defense of Richmond at that point, but he did so in he was a very aggressive commander, and unlike Johnston, who was much like McClellan, had a tendency to be very conservative, Lee was very, very aggressive in defending the city. So that was at the Battle of Seven Pines. And oddly enough, this little mark right here are the runways at the Richmond Airport. And as you can see, it's very close to the intersection of I-64 and 295. And oddly enough, it's right in this area where at Seven Pines, where Johnston got wounded, was basically pretty much right where the airport exists today. So that's where the Battle of Seven Pines was, right at the airport. I don't know exactly how far the airport is from downtown Richmond. I'm going to say 12 miles, 12, 13 miles, something like that. Any event, it's right at the Richmond Airport, pretty much right there where I-64 intersects with the interstate, which is I-295. US Route 60 runs through pretty much the same spot. Anyway, that's pretty much where the Battle of Seven Pines took place. You can see it was very close. Now, at the Battle of Seven Pines, which was a major battle, there were 11,000 combined losses at the Battle of Seven Pines. Okay, but now Lee has been appointed to command the Confederate forces in the Eastern Theater, the East being the southeastern quadrant of the country. We're not talking about Mississippi and Vicksburg and Western Tennessee and all that. We're talking about basically the southeast. So Lee's put in charge. Okay, so at this point, Battle of Seven Pines has taken place. Now, these battles sort of go back and forth, and none of them are totally conclusive. But Lee was successful in the sense that I'm going to run through a number of battles, but the bottom line is in fact, even when we get to Malvern Hill, MH, which was really a Union victory, still Lee successfully kept the Union forces out of the city of Richmond and forced McClellan to try to find another avenue to beat the Confederacy. Now let me just say this, but Richmond's the capital, right? You had over 11,000 losses at the Battle of Seven Pines. Lee has taken over. And a series of battles occur, and they all occur right like in here. All these battles are like here, you know, here. I mean, they're just like one battle after the next over what's known as the 7 days. The 7 days battles. They're really a bunch of battles that took place over a 7-day period that basically roam and straddle I-295, which is, like I said, at any point is probably 8 to 12, 13 miles outside of the city of Richmond, and are all basically the same distance away as the airport is. So you can see how Richmonders felt very besieged by these battles. You've got this huge 100,000 plus army sitting out there, and you've got your boys who are out there defending the city. In any event, so that's the Battle of Seven Pines. After that, you had, like I said, and all these actions occur right in here. I'm not going to pinpoint each one. You had the Battle of Glendale, which is sometimes called Newmarket. There were 7,500 losses there. I think that was up in here somewhere. You have the Battle of Beaver Dam. It's probably somewhere up in here. That there were 1,800 losses combined on both sides. And then you're going to have the Battle of Oak Grove, and we're talking here June 25th of 1862 for the Battle of Oak Grove, about a little over 1,000 losses there. The Battle of Garnett's Farm and Golding's Farm, 630 losses. That was on June 27th and June 28th. What am I missing here? I said Beaver Dam, the courthouse. Anyway, you have this series of battles in here, and eventually the Confederates are at least successful, even if sometimes the Confederates are successful, sometimes the Union is successful, but eventually McClellan, who's fairly conservative, thinks he's outnumbered, and he's, Lee's bloodied him up pretty good. So he decides he's really not that much more interested, but he retreats to this place called Malvern Hill right here. There's a second little bump down here, this little curve in the, and there's high ground here. And the Union forces took the high ground there. And you'll see this as a recurring theme in the Civil War, where somebody will try frontal assaults and they'll get annihilated. Why? They never learned their lesson. But when I look at certain battles in the Civil War, I'm always amazed that everybody thinks that they can do frontal assaults in the open, charging basically, well, I won't say totally shoulder to shoulder, but pretty close to that, and succeed. Because we'll see that at Fredericksburg, where the Union got annihilated trying that. Of course, at Gettysburg, with Lee tried it with Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, and he got annihilated. And then oddly enough, Grant tries the same thing. We'll see in the Overland campaign at Cold Harbor in 1864 against Lee, and he gets annihilated. So anyway, but Lee tries it at Malvern Hill. Lee gets beat down here. This is this is June. Malvern Hill, that's July 1st, actually, 1862. Interesting, isn't it? 1 year before the start of the Battle of Gettysburg. Lee gets beat at Malvern Hill, basically trying to push the Union off the high ground, and he gets beat. But after the battle, McClellan doesn't have the stomach for any more fighting, and he wants to come back down here to Harrison's Landing. What's the name of that landing? Down there near Hopewell. But anyway, he wants to retreat down there and use that as his base of operations. But that was the end of the Peninsula Campaign, and after that, McClellan and Lincoln sort of have a falling out, and the action gets pushed further north in 1863 to Chancellorsville, Fredericksburg, and the action shifts basically more to northern Virginia and to, of course, there's the Battle of Antietam. And then in 1863, of course, there's the Battle of Gettysburg, which kind of is a turning point in the war. But the point is Richmond is the main focus of attention. The Union wants Richmond because they believe the rebellion will collapse if Richmond is taken. That's where the Confederate administration is. And so I think that all told there were about, you know, there are considerable, I tried to add up the losses, but I came to the conclusion that, let's see, 2,500, 3,000, 5,000, 16,000, 30,000, 40,000, 50. I get total losses here in the neighborhood of about, I mean, killed, wounded, or captured, if you add all these actions up, to be about 50,000 killed, wounded, or captured in the Peninsula campaign. It might be even a little bit more than that. Okay, so that, like I said, that's 1862, and that's the Peninsula campaign. And just notice that, I can't emphasize enough, these battles are right outside the city of Richmond. And so the people probably could hear the gunfire, you know, of the cannons rumble, because the size of the armies was fairly significant. And we're talking several hundred cannons on both sides, so it probably made quite a noise. It was probably very, very frightening for the citizens. Okay, so Johnston's out of the picture. Okay, now here's a guy who must have been a real firecracker. This is A.P. Hill. He is not on Monument Avenue. However, his statue is located on Laburnum Avenue, and I think it's Laburnum and Hermitage, I think, in the city of Richmond. And interestingly enough, I don't have a video of A.P. Hill's statue, but I do have these pictures. I didn't make a video because he's not on Monument Avenue. But A.P. Hill, he must have been quite a temperamental kind of guy, but he was a very valiant warrior for certain. Had a very distinguished career as a general as well. He was, and just like all of these Confederate generals, he attended West Point and actually served in the U.S. military in the Mexican-American War and in the Seminole Wars prior to the Civil War. Initially, he was the commander of the famous Light Division under General Longstreet. The Light Division was known for traveling with very little gear, and Hill insisted that his troops be able to maneuver speedily. But at the 7 Days Battle, Hill and Longstreet apparently didn't get along very much and had a very public disagreement, which eventually Hill challenged Longstreet to a duel. Well, Lee, not wanting to have two of his better commanders get into a tussle, transferred A.P. Hill to 2nd Corps under Stonewall Jackson, with whom he also argued at times. And in fact, one time it got so bad that Jackson had him arrested. But Hill was a good commander. He played a crucial role in the victory at Second Bull Run and at Cedar Mountain. He helped save Lee from disaster after a long forced march, arriving at Antietam just in time to save one of Lee's flanks from destruction by the Union Army. Interestingly enough, he was at Gettysburg, and most of the men in Pickett's charge were men from Longstreet's 3rd Corps, men from A.P. Hill's newly formed 3rd Corps. But even though General Longstreet was in charge, the head of the head guy in charge of Pickett's charge, of course Lee was the one who really wanted the assault. But anyway, A.P. Hill was put. Initially, Lee had formed 2 corps. One was after the 7 Days Battle, or was it Seven Pines? Anyway, he formed the Army of Northern Virginia into 2 corps. One was under Longstreet, one was under Jackson. Of course, after Hill was transferred to Jackson, Jackson, after very distinguished career in his own right, was mortally wounded at Chancellorsville, and at that time, Lee decided to create a third corps, and he put A.P. Hill in charge of Third Corps, so after Chancellorsville, A.P. Hill was basically on the same rung as Longstreet and where Jackson was, and he served as commander of the Third Corps until the end of the war. Okay, let's see, what else do we have here? Okay, very sadly, Hill, who in 1864 had, he did participate with distinction at the Battle of the Wilderness. However, he had problems with bad health during a lot of 1864, and he wasn't present for the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, but he certainly was present at the Battle of Petersburg, because unfortunately, very, very sadly, 1 week before Lee's surrender at Appomattox during the end of the Battle of Petersburg, the siege of Petersburg, the long siege of Petersburg, he was mortally wounded riding near the front lines, was shot through the heart only 1 week before the end of the war. And like all these guys, they were a little bit younger than you might think they were. For example, A.P. Hill was just right around the age of 40, maybe even less than 40. I don't think he quite reached his 40th birthday when he was killed at the siege of Petersburg. So anyway, that's A.P. Hill, another interesting Confederate general. Interestingly enough, Hill is buried at this monument, at the base of this monument. So there you have it. That's I thought that A.P. Hill deserves some recognition here. These pictures of these seemingly small streams/rivers are in fact the North Anna River, where the Battle of the North Anna River took place, and I'm going to point that location out in the video discussing Grant's overland campaign. And now we're come to 1864. In 1864, we have Ulysses S. Grant. This is after Gettysburg. And Lincoln's upset with George Meade, who beat Lee at Gettysburg, for not pursuing Lee hard enough. And there was a battle up here, way up here near Fredericksburg, called the Wilderness. What's in Spotsylvania County, actually. There's a battle called the Wilderness. And then there was Spotsylvania Courthouse, both extremely bloody battles. And in when was it? In March, first week of March of 1864, Lincoln, he wants an aggressive commander. In fact, before the Wilderness and before Spotsylvania Courthouse, he appoints Grant, whose one and sole purpose is, well, oddly enough, is basically to crush the rebel army. I mean, he just wants to, he just wants to kill Confederate soldiers, because the Confederacy cannot replace soldiers as fast as the Union can, and the South doesn't have the resources to outproduce the North in terms of material, so he just wants to pulverize Lee. So Lee successfully, at least, I'm not going to get into who won the Battle of the Spotsylvania or Spotsylvania Courthouse or the Wilderness, but suffice it to say, the end result was that Grant had to disengage, and he would come down from basically the Fredericksburg, Spotsylvania area. He would keep going southeast to the south. He tried to go around Lee's right. He was trying to get down here. And the reason for that would become apparent a little while later, but he ends up, after the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, he ends up at the North Anna River. This is like, when is it? I think it's, well, before, he's coming south after Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse. Interestingly enough, they're right here, back in 1864 at the intersection of 295 and Interstate, this is Interstate 95 right here. About 9 miles north of Richmond, there was a place called Yellow Tavern. And George Custer, well, Phil Sheridan and George Custer of Little Bighorn fame was part of Sheridan's cavalry troops at that time. And they had the famous battle at Yellow Tavern. And the unfortunate thing about Yellow Tavern, this was, I believe, about what? Yellow Tavern is May 11th, 1864. Yellow Tavern, Jeb Stuart, Robert E. Lee's eyes and ears, his commanding cavalry officer, is mortally wounded at the Battle of Yellow Tavern, which is right here. Like I said, this is about 8 or 9 miles north of the city of Richmond, right here. As a matter of fact, after that battle, the Union cavalry probably could have come into Richmond, and I think it was Sheridan. He decided not to do that because he was afraid he would be cut off from his supplies, because Lee was backed up here, and if he comes in down here, he could have been cut off from Grant's main force. So he sort of chickened out, and he went on to another objective. And I think he may have actually, at that point, well, I don't even want to go there. Anyway, I'll leave that to the historians. I think I know the answer to that, but I'm not sure. But anyway, so Grant is up here, Lee's up here. Lee's on the south side of the North Anna River. The North Anna is 9 miles north of Ashland, which is Ashland's 18 miles north of Richmond. So we're talking 27 miles north of Richmond on the North Anna River. In the third week of May of 1864, during Grant's overland campaign. It's called the Overland Campaign. There's the Battle of the North Anna River, and it's underappreciated because the Confederates dug in and sort of engaged and actually built trenches. This sort of presaged what would happen during World War I and everything. They were up there for a couple of days. Lee's defenses there were so formidable that Grant once again decided to push southeast this direction. And once again, he sort of comes through the Hanover Courthouse area, and I think even I don't think Hanover's courthouse records exist for the years 1860 to 1865 because they were sort of a casualty of the war, but that's an interesting story in and of itself. But in any event, so Grant's coming down this way after the battle at North Anna River. At North Anna, let's see here, losses were about 5,400 troops at North Anna. Losses at the Battle of Yellow Tavern were about 900. That's combined for both. That's killed, wounded, and captured. Okay, so now Grant's coming this way, and Lee is trying to head him off. So we see all this stuff, and then Lee comes down to this place, and I think called Cold, well, let's put it this way. There was a battle at Totopotomoy Creek, and one at Hawes Shop, which was basically a cavalry action. And these are like up in this area up here. And let me see, the total combined losses were about, for those two battles, the Battle of the Totopotomoy Creek and Hawes Shop combined about 3,000 losses in those two engagements. So that brings us to the major action here at Cold Harbor. And this was, like I said, very near, once again, to I-60. Well, it's probably more up in here. Right up in here. At Cold Harbor. This is where Grant made some frontal assaults against Lee, and Lee basically, annihilated Union's Grant's assaults that day, and it was really the last military victory that Lee had during the war. His last victory, and this was, we're talking Cold Harbor, was May 31st through June 12th, 1864. Total losses during the Battle of Cold Harbor were 17,500. Okay, and then, but Grant has so many troops and he can replenish. Lee can't. I mean, at this point, even though he won at Cold Harbor, Lee's troops are really suffering because they can't replace troops, and the troops that Lee has are ill-equipped. And then Grant, who at this point is sitting right here, and Lee is sort of sitting right here, and Grant sort of fakes Lee out. And he gets down here, and he is able to cross the James River. Lee didn't quite pick up on the fact that Grant was going to move that fast across the James River. So Grant got down here to Petersburg. Now Lee reacts, of course. This is Lee. But he's a little bit slow. He gets down there fast enough in the summer of 1864 to prevent Grant from taking Petersburg. But this turns into a full-blown siege that lasts from basically the late summer of 1864 until, well, for all intents and purposes, the first week of April, or the end of March of 1865. And during those months that the siege occurred, there's a railroad line that comes in here. And this was really the only means of supply for Richmond, I think, at the latter stages of the war. Somebody may want to check me on that, but this was one reason why Richmond would fall if Petersburg fell. Grant was trying to cut off a main source of supply for Richmond because they weren't going to get any from this direction, and now Sheridan pretty much had controlled this area up here. So basically, this is what was left in the southeast from Carolina could supply Richmond up through Petersburg in that way. But now Grant's down there, and in the last week of March of 1860, Petersburg falls in 1865, end of March, early April 1865. So anyway, you can see how this area, the folks here would be very shell-shocked. And I counted up the casualties. So if you count the Overland Campaign and the Peninsula Campaign, I think the figure I came up with in terms of total losses, both sides combined, was somewhere 140 to about 150, 155,000. Somebody can check me on that. That's a lot of people, and you can see that, especially the siege of Petersburg, people down here, the Union Army was camped down here for a long time. Now this is only 20 miles away, okay? And in the so anyway, that's to give you some idea of why Richmond was the focus, and when it fell, the Confederate rebellion fell, and it had been the object of the war from Lincoln, that they thought that was the thing that would end the war, and it pretty much did. So Richmond is sort of unique in that respect, more so than any other city. Other cities have suffered as well, particularly like Atlanta. Some places were burned, but Richmond was subjected and was the focus of the campaign throughout the war. Anyway, I'm David Lentz with ReasonBalance.com. Thanks for joining us. Okay, this is kind of the forgotten character, well, I shouldn't say character, the forgotten statue on Monument Avenue. But this guy had actually a lot of positive, profound effect on, back in those days, commerce and life for everyone, because he sort of dedicated his life to understanding ocean currents and the wind. And so some of his work and studies were used by sailors, and his works actually improved seafaring commerce in the later 1800s. This is Matthew Fontaine Maury, born in 1806 and he died in 1872. He's known as the Pathfinder of the Seas, originally of the U.S. Navy, but Maury's seagoing days were shortened by he broke his leg before the Civil War. He, however, is best known internationally for very important publications work he did in the field of navigation of the seas. He's particularly interested in wind patterns and ocean currents. The product of his work was international recognition, the publication in 1847 of Wind and Current Chart of the North Atlantic. This assisted sailors in reducing the time for ocean-going voyages, which enhanced commerce. His study of currents and winds led him to believe that, at least at times, there was a navigable Northwest Passage in areas near the Arctic Circle that were not totally blocked by ice. And in fact, that is true today. We can have this argument, I guess, about global warming or not, but it appears now that there is a navigable Northwest Passage. He advocated international cooperation in matters relating to the study of weather and the oceans, and it had much to do with getting many nations, sometimes even enemies, to share basic data regarding weather and currents. He did much that led to the establishment of the U.S. Naval Observatory. Maury had a long and very distinguished career. He was widely respected. While he did resign his naval commission and join the Confederacy at the start of the war, there's some indications, I guess, and I don't want to really, like I say, get into these guys' relationships with slaves, that he was not a big fan of slavery. But like I said, I'm not... all right. He was in charge when he was with the Confederacy. He was chief of Seacoast, River, and Harbor Defenses. However, he spent a lot of time trying to talk foreign powers into exercising some influence to try to stop the war. He did develop a mine to be used against Union shipping and did a lot of work abroad trying to obtain ships for the Confederacy. After the Civil War, Maury was offered many distinguished academic positions, but he became a physics professor at VMI. There's a whole lot more about Maury, who led a fascinating life, for those who are interested. Okay, so here we have Robert E. Lee, and trying to encapsulate or briefly describe in a few words the life of any person is presumptuous and futile, but to me at least this is particularly true of Lee, especially in a contentious context like this one is. To me at least, to get an idea of Lee, you just have to look at a photo of him, and he sort of looks, to me at least, that like a trusted uncle. Jeff Davis and Southern soldiers must have been similarly impressed, because they certainly did a lot of hard fighting for them, and I think he always held the respect of his troops. He is probably the closest thing there is to a canonized Southern saint in the eyes of many white Southerners. He attended West Point, where he graduated second in his class. He fought in the Mexican-American War. Where did you hear that before? It seems like all these guys did that. He captured John Brown at Harper's Ferry before the war, when John Brown tried to sort of start an insurrection by capturing the arsenal at Harper's Ferry, and he was going to start an anti-slave movement up there. But Lee became commandant of West Point later on, and while he was commandant is when he first met Jeb Stuart. He was offered command of Union forces when it appeared that hostilities would break out with the South, but he turned it down, not wanting to make war on his native Virginia. He became a military advisor to Jeff Davis at the beginning of the war. He was not immediately put in charge of the Confederate Army. Some people think that that was the case, but that's not true. He didn't become commander of Confederate forces initially in the Eastern Theater until the Battle of Seven Pines, which we'll discuss in another part of this video. But after the Battle of Seven Pines, when Joe Johnston was wounded, he was given command of Confederate forces in the East, and later he was pretty much calling all the shots. Let's see here. After the Peninsula Campaign of 1862, he reorganized the army in the Eastern Theater, which is basically southeast United States. Not, I'm excluding Western Tennessee and Mississippi and those areas. That was the Western Theater. After the Peninsula Campaign in 1862, he reorganized the army, the Confederate Army, into two corps, First Corps and Second Corps. He gave Longstreet the First Corps, put Stonewall Jackson in charge of the Second Corps. Later, he created a Third Corps, which was later commanded by A.P. Hill. Now, Hill doesn't have a monument on Monument Avenue. He is over on Laburnum, and I think Hermitage, roads. But, and unfortunately for Hill, he was killed 1 week before the end of the war during the siege of Petersburg. And unlike these other monuments, which are not burial plots, A.P. Hill is actually buried in his monument, and I think he's buried standing up. But anyway, that's another story. Back to Lee now. Lee successfully defended Richmond from McClellan's Peninsula Campaign in 1862. He beat Union Generals Pope, Burnside, and Hooker at Second Manassas, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville, respectively. He was actually able to take an arguably inferior Confederate army north and take the fight to the Union. He took the fight up to Maryland and then later to Pennsylvania. But unfortunately for him and the Confederate cause, he lost at Gettysburg and at Antietam. He fought a series of hotly contested bloody battles against future President Ulysses S. Grant during the 1864 Overland Campaign, which we will discuss later in Northern Virginia. He beat Grant at Cold Harbor, which was actually Lee's last victory, and with his forces depleted because he couldn't replace his forces. The Confederate Army was at that point not very well supplied. It was ill-equipped. Its forces were depleted, so his forces ultimately succumbed and were beaten at the siege of Petersburg by Grant and Union forces. And when Petersburg fell, Richmond could no longer really be supplied, and thereafter Richmond immediately fell, and Lee ultimately had to surrender at Appomattox to Grant, and the war came to close. Now, it's interesting to note that Lee was not in favor of continuing the war in terms of creating a guerrilla warfare situation where he would retreat into the mountains and take targets of opportunity. He was very much in favor of having the nation heal itself after the war. And he later became president of what is now Washington and Lee College out in Lexington, Virginia, and he died in 1870. Okay, now it should be remembered that the Confederate statues on Monument Avenue were erected 30 to 60 years after the Civil War, so it wasn't these men who directed that they be erected. I guess that goes without saying. But it was the survivors of the wars and one or two generations of their heirs that elected to construct these monuments. Naturally, Arthur Ashe being the exception. He was erected or dedicated in 1996. But Lee, for example, his monument was erected in 1890 to an estimated, when his statue was unveiled, to an estimated crowd of 100,000 people. Now that's a huge number of people by any measure, but it is particularly large when one considers that in 1860, the population of Richmond was right around 40,000 people. Now, by war's end, the estimates are that it had risen considerably to 130 to, I even saw, even 150,000 people. But 100,000 people, that means virtually everybody was there, and then some, really, probably. I would imagine a lot of people, the reason, I don't know, I have no idea, but I would imagine the one reason why the population of Richmond got large towards the end of the war was people out in the farmlands around Richmond were probably looking for protection because there were a considerable number of Union raids in the area, and so they were probably looking for protection. But that of course added to some of the problems that I'm sure that they had in Richmond. For example, they had bread riots, I know, and things of that nature. But things weren't always, certainly with the enemy at the gates, so to speak, situation wasn't always that great in Richmond. Anyway, Jeb Stuart was erected in 1907. Stonewall Jackson was erected in 1919. Maury was erected in 1929, and Jeff Davis was also erected in 1907. Like I said, Arthur Ashe was erected or dedicated in 1996, and it's really a tribute to the people in Richmond, their ability to get along, that they could settle on having Arthur Ashe on Monument Avenue along with the Confederate generals. What also needs to be kept in mind is that post-war, the Union occupation of the city was what it was like and the effects thereof. I mean, I'm trying to give you a general idea of what the people of Richmond, what these monuments mean to the people that had them constructed, and what they mean to, the heirs of the people who suffered through the war. The post-war Union occupation of the city, one has to keep that in mind. I'm sure that for a while it was sort of like having an occupation force. And then there's the issue of carpetbagging for those who want to explore what the post-war years were like in Richmond. So people were striving for something to hold on to in terms of their lost cause. But all that's a complicated subject beyond this video. Let's see. What else do we need here? As is discussed in this video, the enemy always seemed to be constantly at the gates of the city of Richmond. Remember the heavy Union troop concentrations that existed in the city of Washington, which is only about 100 miles to the north. Norfolk was eliminated as a port providing supply by May of 1862. And as the war wore on, supplying the city became increasingly difficult, which of course caused hardships for the city of Richmond. For example, like I mentioned, the bread riots in the city of Richmond during the war. For example, but consider this. For example, even when the war was going well, and Lee had pushed the Union forces north and had actually pushed into Maryland and into Pennsylvania about the time of the Battle of Gettysburg. Even during those times, which were the good times, actually that is when they had the bread riots. So even when times were good in the city of Richmond, they weren't. They must have still been pretty bad. So in a sense, removing these statues overlooks the feeling of the citizens of the former era who felt it necessary to give expression to their experiences and their considerable sacrifices during war. And you know, as part of the video here, I described the Overland Campaign and the Peninsula Campaign. And lest I forget to mention it, as the war wore on, Petersburg became increasingly important because it was one of the few routes for supplying the city of Richmond with goods. There's a railroad junction down there in Petersburg. And so when Petersburg fell, it basically made holding Richmond and defending Richmond impossible, and it was then that Lee basically left for southwestern Virginia, but he only got to Appomattox before he was basically forced to surrender to Grant. So when Petersburg fell, then Appomattox occurred immediately after that, and the Confederacy pretty much fell. There was some sporadic fighting afterwards, but that was basically the end of the war. That was in April of 1865. And of course, this is Arthur Ashe, and of course he is sort of on the other side of the coin here. His statue was erected in 1996, a man of great quality and integrity. And you'll notice that in his statue that he's got the book a little bit higher than the tennis racket to basically emphasize that kids should study and put that ahead of becoming, playing sports, because that's a sure path to a successful life, I guess. But looking at some of the salaries out there, one has to wonder about that. But I guess statistically, that's probably true. Anyway, I didn't want to go there. But Arthur Ashe was a native Richmonder. He was born on July 10th, 1943. He was the first black player to play for the U.S. Davis Cup team. He was the first black player to win at Wimbledon, the U.S. Open, and the Australian Open. He died, unfortunately, just prior to his 50th birthday, prematurely, obviously, from complications of the HIV virus, which was believed to be caused by virtue of the fact that he had heart bypass surgery, and he received an infusion of HIV-infected blood. What an unfortunate circumstance. As a result of his illness, he started the Arthur Ashe Urban Institute for Health and the Arthur Ashe Foundation. The latter being for the purpose of educating the public about and to help eradicate AIDS. Ashe attended Richmond's Maggie Walker High School, but because of segregationist policies in Richmond during that time, he had to move to St. Louis to fine-tune his tennis skills. He was the first African American to win the National Junior Tennis Indoor Championship. He attended UCLA, where he joined the ROTC and later graduated with a bachelor's degree in business. He then joined the Army as a second lieutenant. Ashe always demonstrated great sportsmanship and courtside etiquette during his career. Also fought many battles against racial discrimination. In particular, his actions played a crucial role in focusing world attention on the wrongful and racially discriminatory practices of apartheid in South Africa, generally as they pertained to tennis in particular. Twice he was arrested for protesting against apartheid. Certainly a character that Richmond can be very proud of. And Richmond can be proud of the fact that they erected this statue down here on Monument Avenue as well. Okay, where does that leave us? Well, one has to wonder whether aggressively demanding one's rights is always the smartest strategy for either side in this debate. What I mean is that if I'm at the local convenience store, for example, and the clerk and I are interrupted by another customer, causing the clerk to forget to give me my change, I wouldn't say, I demand that you do your job and give me my change right now. No. Instead, most of us would try the polite approach and probably politely clear our throat and mildly say something like, "Excuse me, may I please have my change?" and then thank him for giving us our change. We had the right to the change, but things usually go much better if we politely ask for it instead of demanding it. Similarly, most of the time, another person is more likely to cooperate with us if we show them respect and politely request what we want and not demand it or demean the other party or, heaven forbid, threaten violence if they don't give us what we want. Showing respect for others and recognizing their legitimate concerns is the key. It's a natural corollary to following the golden rule and treating others as we would like to be treated. And sometimes that means giving up something that we are entitled to, all so that we can generate some goodwill. Slavery is awful, discrimination is awful, and so is treating others like they don't matter. The fact of the matter is that some folks, the statue's opponents, will find some of those statues offensive because of their association with the enslavement of their ancestors. Most right-minded people would understand why this is so. It appears that this fact should be obvious. It thus appears that supporters of keeping the statues need to show more respect to some of the opponents and recognize this fact. Similarly, those statues are a part of our history and our heritage, and the men depicted did have several characteristics that all people should greatly admire, despite the somewhat understandable shortcomings of supporting slavery. Now, when I say somewhat understandable, I'm going back to my discussion of in world history, slavery was a recognized institution, and in a sense, these guys were being old-fashioned and not moving along with the times as fast as others would like, but it wasn't like they were the inventors of slavery. In any event, these men had other characteristics which are admired by everyone, such as courage and sacrificing one's career and life to defend one's homeland and way of life. What I've shown in this video hopefully has demonstrated the sacrifice made by these men and the trials and tribulations of the citizens of the city of Richmond during the Civil War. And importantly, opponents of these statutes need to recognize all of what I just said. To its great credit, it would seem that Richmonders, up until now at least, opponents of the statues included, have, to their great credit, indeed let bygones be bygones and allowed proponents or supporters of these statues to enjoy the statues. Moreover, most, not all, but most, supporters of the statues do not remotely advocate reinstitution of slavery, nor do they believe in discrimination against any race, creed, or color. Also, opponents of the statues need to recognize the reality that Richmond is unique in that it has benefited from tourism. It has benefited from the tourism that comes from Richmond's historical roots to being the capital of the Confederacy. There's no other capital of the Confederacy. Richmond is unique. What I'm saying is that if both sides would continue to try to recognize and respect the other side's views, the issues that frankly have been foisted on Richmond to a large extent by outsiders, not totally by outsiders, but largely by outsiders and outside events, may yet be peacefully resolved to everyone's benefit and satisfaction. For example, one could see a scenario where it might be desirable to have the city tax assessor send out with the real estate tax bill every year a box that could be checked, allowing residents of the city of Richmond to make a voluntary contribution to the monument, with all monies after payment of all upkeep expenses going to, for example, a slave museum or to some civil rights or non-discrimination related charity. One could put in the ordinance that if the contributions do not exceed a specified amount for 2 successive years, that a referendum would automatically be held on removal of the monuments. And if the vote was that the monuments should be removed, then so be it. That way, in a sense, these men will have atoned for the wrongs of slavery, and supporters of the statues can continue to enjoy them. Well, that's a possible solution. I'm sure there are others, but the discussions should continue. Anyway, that's it for now. I hope that you've enjoyed this video. I'm David Lentz for ReasonandBalance.com. Thanks for watching. Boop boop bop boop ba dum bum. Boop boop bop boop ba dum ba da dum da dum da dum ba dum bum. Beep bop boop bop boop bop boop da ba dum bum. Beep bop boop bop boop 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 ba dum bum. Boop boop bop boop ba dum bum. Boop boop bop boop ba dum ba da dum da dum ba dum bum. Beep bop boop bop boop bop boop da ba dum bum. Beep bop boop bop boop 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 ba dum bum.